Hey everyone, this is Craig from OraPub. In this video tutorial, I'm going to talk and demonstrate how to identify the key Oracle processes using the PS in the top command. The reason we're doing this is to help you solve every Oracle performance problem that you ever encounter. So let's get started. A really good question is, well, why do I need to know this? Well, if you've ever run the PS or the top command at the operating system on an active Oracle system, you're going to see a lot of processes. And you've probably been wondering, well, what are they doing? How do they work together? And how do they fit together and integrate with Oracle's memory and data file and all the other parts of Oracle's architecture? If you've wondered about this, then I think you're really going to like this video tutorial. To help simplify things, there are really only three different types of processes in an Oracle system. There are the client processes, which are sometimes called the user processes. There's the foreground processes, which are sometimes called the server or shadow processes. And then there's also the background processes. So let's take a look at each of these in a lot more detail. So first, we have the client process. Then we have its foreground process, and then we have a number of background processes. Now let's see how the memory hooks into this. You can see the foreground process has its own private memory, and that's called the PGA, or the Process Global Area. And then we have the System Global Area, Oracle's main cache, and on Linux, that's usually held within Linux huge pages. Now let's add into the mix the Oracle database files. There's three types of Oracle database files. First, we have the database files, as they're called. They typically end in DBF. Then we have the Oracle redo logs. Those typically end in LOG. And then we also have control files, which I didn't show in this diagram. Now let's look at the client or the user processes. The client processes, they send and receive information to and from their associated foreground process. For example, it could send a SQL statement along with a command to parse or execute that SQL statement. An example client processes are SQL Plus, Toad, SQL Developer. Basically, that's any process that communicates with a foreground process, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now you'll notice the hash marks in the picture right here, and that's to show you that the client processes can reside on the database server or on another machine. And in production systems, usually the client process resides on another machine. And when this occurs, it communicates with its foreground process using what's called SQLnet. Now this is super important. Client processes cannot read or write to Oracle's data, memory, or files. The reading, the writing, and all that, that is done with the foreground processes. So let's talk about the foreground process for a second. Foreground processes, which are sometimes called the server or shadow processes, they are the bridge between the client processes and actually like Oracle's data, memory, and file structures. You see, the foreground processes, they send and receive messages with their associated client process. It's the foreground processes that read and write Oracle's memory, the data, and the file structures. Foreground processes, they do most of the heavy lifting that we see on Oracle systems. And they allow Oracle to scale, to use a lot of the computing resources. So foreground processes, in a sense, do the client processes work. So they've got to have the ability to read and write Oracle's shared memory structures. They've got to be able to read and write Oracle's shared data files, and they've got to read and write their own private memory, which is called the PGA. Now, background processes are really interesting because they have very specific tasks and they run independently while still having the ability to sometimes receive and send messages from and to both foreground processes and other background processes. They also prevent Oracle processes from doing harmful things. For example, preventing the database writer from writing committed data before the associated details have been safely written to one of the online redo logs. Now it's time to take a look at this in real life. So I'm on a Linux system, and it would be really cool if you could do this on your system as well. So I did the PS, and you can see very quickly, we can identify the client processes, which are SQL Plus in this example. You can also see the client processes associated foreground processes, and you can see the background processes. And you'll immediately notice there are a lot of background processes. So to finish off this video tutorial, I want to show you the top command, which is the Linux and Unix process monitor. Every Oracle DBA should have access to this. Right when I came in, I hit the letter C to expand the command. And then you can see that we have a bunch of Oracle foreground processes just kind of sticking up there, hanging up there at the top. And that is very typical of an active Oracle system because the foreground processes do a lot of work. But you'll notice the background processes, they kind of pop up, do some work, and then they're gone. Right? And then they pop up again, they do some work, and they're gone. And that's kind of the cycle, and that's what Oracle background processes do. They have very specific tasks. I hope you enjoyed this short video tutorial. And if you're into Oracle Performance Optimization, man, I hope you check out my website. I got a ton of resources out there to help you master Oracle Performance Tuning. I wish you all the best in your Oracle Performance Tuning endeavors.